Everyone on the Dick Van Dyke Show looked like family on screen, but behind the scenes, one star never quite fit in. Richard Deacon, who played the uptight Mel Cooley, was known for his dry wit and perfect timing. Yet there was one person he secretly could not stand. And it wasn't Dick Van Dyke. It was the show's creator, Carl Reiner. Once you know why, it changes how you see the show forever. To millions of viewers, Richard Deacon was the perfect supporting character. As Mel Cooley, the balding, stone-faced television executive, he brought dry humor and constant awkward tension, especially in scenes with the wisecracking Maury Amsterdam or the unpredictable Dick Van Dyke. But most fans never realized that Deacon wasn't playing a role far from reality. Behind the scenes, he was serious, reserved, and often on edge, especially when Carl Reiner walked into the room. Carl Reiner, the creator and head writer, was a powerhouse, loud, driven, always joking, and constantly rewriting scripts at the last minute. His comedy was fast-paced and loose, completely different from Deacon's methodical, structured approach to acting. Deacon came from a background in theater and drama, where preparation, rhythm, and precision were everything. Reiner thrived in chaos. That contrast set the stage for years of quiet friction. People close to the production later hinted that Deacon often felt overlooked. While stars like Dick Van Dyke and Mary Tyler Moore were showered with praise, and Reiner himself made cameos and gave interviews, Deacon faded into the background, both professionally and socially. He was essential to the ensemble, but rarely recognized as such. In a rare interview from the late 1970s, he said that working on The Dick Van Dyke Show felt like showing up for a party you were never invited to. Whether he meant it as a joke or not, the tone was dry and the message was clear. Something never sat right. The tension wasn't just about screen time, it was about respect. Deacon, who had years of stage and film experience, reportedly clashed with Reiner over constant rewrites. He hated being handed new lines minutes before filming, while Reiner thought last-minute changes kept things fresh. Deacon thought it was sloppy. Over time, that difference in philosophy turned into quiet resentment. Unlike his co-stars, who thrived in the spotlight and enjoyed the camaraderie that came with success, Deacon was almost allergic to attention. He wasn't the type to hang around the set joking between takes. He arrived on time, delivered exactly what was expected, and disappeared before the applause stopped. His performance as Mel Cooley seemed effortless, but what audiences didn't see was how much he detested chaos. The show, for all its brilliance, was built on spontaneity, rewrites, improvised jokes, last-minute scene changes. Reiner loved it. Deacon hated it. Cast and crew members later recalled moments that showed just how deep the divide ran. In one instance, Reiner handed out a completely new version of a scene just 10 minutes before shooting. Everyone rolled with it except Deacon. He read the pages silently, excused himself, and walked off set without a word. No shouting, no argument, just silence. It was his quiet protest. Deacon eventually drew clear boundaries. He refused to improvise, even when encouraged. He stuck to the script and asked for clarifications if Reiner threw in unexpected jokes. To others, it was just creative play. To Deacon, it was chaos he couldn't tolerate. His interviews offered more clues. Deacon rarely spoke publicly, but when he did, he chose his words with surgical care. He praised Dick Van Dyke's timing, Mary Tyler Moore's poise, and Maury Amsterdam's wit. But when asked about Carl Reiner, he dodged. In one early 1980s interview, when asked about Reiner's influence, he replied simply, "The writing was strong. The cast was stronger. No elaboration, no enthusiasm, just distance." Even decades later, when the show was celebrated in retrospectives and anniversary specials, Deacon's name was noticeably absent from panels and reunions. Reiner never addressed it publicly, but those who had worked with both men said the tension had never lifted. By the time The Dick Van Dyke Show ended in 1966, the rest of the cast had formed lifelong friendships. Dick Van Dyke and Mary Tyler Moore reunited often. Maury Amsterdam stayed close with nearly everyone. Reiner continued working with many of them on new projects and specials. But Richard Deacon disappeared, not from acting, but from them. He skipped wrap parties, never appeared in reunion photos, and avoided the nostalgic interviews the others enjoyed. His absence became part of his legacy. Fans who adored Mel Cooley's awkward charm wondered why Deacon refused to celebrate the show that made him famous. Why no interviews, no commentaries, no tributes? One producer who worked with him in the late 1960s offered a simple explanation. Richard Deacon was a man who valued structure and respect above all else. And the Dick Van Dyke Show, for all its genius, gave him neither. According to one producer, Richard Deacon would only agree to take part in promotional content for the Dick Van Dyke Show if certain names were not mentioned. When pressed, he allegedly named Carl Reiner specifically. The producer didn't elaborate, but the implication was clear. The relationship had not ended on good terms. Industry insiders often said Deacon resented the way Reiner handled the show's creative direction. He reportedly felt his character was sidelined in later seasons. Even though Mel Cooley was a fan favorite, many believed Deacon thought Reiner favored the more spontaneous, improvisational actors, those who matched his fast-paced style. Deacon, a classically trained stage actor who valued structure and discipline, may have felt alienated in a production that thrived on unpredictability. Beyond creative clashes, there was a quieter frustration simmering beneath the surface. Friends noted that Deacon hated being typecast. After years of playing fussy bureaucrats, neurotic managers, and similar roles under different names, he began to resent it. The Dick Van Dyke Show, despite its acclaim, may have felt like the beginning of that trap. In a 1971 radio interview, Deacon once said, "Television has a way of putting you in a box and then locking the lid." When the host asked if he meant Mel Cooley, Deacon smiled and said, "You said it, not me." As the years went by, the divide between Deacon and the rest of the cast widened. Reiner, always charming and outgoing, appeared unbothered or perhaps uninterested in addressing the tension. But fans who paid attention noticed something had fractured. It wasn't just artistic differences, it felt personal. Then, just when the silence seemed permanent, an unexpected moment reignited speculation. In the early 1990s, a small public television station in Illinois aired a retrospective series on classic sitcoms. It featured rare interviews, bloopers, and behind-the-scenes stories long forgotten. One episode focused on the Dick Van Dyke Show, and among the usual tributes, a short audio clip surfaced that startled longtime fans. The recording from the mid-1970s wasn't a formal interview, but rather a taped conversation from a regional theater fundraiser. In it, Richard Deacon briefly mentioned the show that had made him a household name. The audio was grainy and scratchy, but his voice was unmistakable. When asked by another guest if he ever missed working with Carl Reiner, Deacon laughed and said, "Miss it? I'm just glad I survived it." The remark was followed by silence, then a quick change of subject. But that single sentence, half joking, half serious, stuck in people's minds. What did he mean by survived it? Was it dry humor or something deeper? Some theorized that Deacon felt creatively stifled under Reiner's control. Reiner loved improvisation, collaboration, and spontaneous rewrites, everything that clashed with Deacon's perfectionist nature. Others suggested Reiner saw Deacon as a utility player, useful when a script needed a straight man or a punchline, but rarely essential to the story. Many also pointed out how Deacon's character was often the butt of the joke, the one mocked for his fussiness, baldness, or lack of charm. While that fit Mel Cooley's role, insiders believed it took a toll on Deacon personally. He struggled with self-image and longed for roles that reflected his depth and range, something he never got while working under Reiner's leadership. There were even persistent rumors that during the fourth season, Deacon requested more meaningful screen time, a plea that was allegedly dismissed without discussion. He wasn't fired, but the message was unmistakable. Know your place. After that, Deacon reportedly stopped attending production meetings unless absolutely necessary. The resurfaced audio clip gained quiet traction years later in niche online forums, where old television fans and media historians debated its meaning. Was it bitterness, humor, or the lingering echo of a creative partnership that never truly worked? And while the story never reached mainstream headlines, it confirmed what many had long suspected. Richard Deacon's absence from the Dick Van Dyke Show's legacy wasn't due to time, distance, or forgetfulness. It was personal. And what happened after his death only deepened that sense of unease. When Richard Deacon passed away in 1984 from heart complications at just 63, tributes poured in. Fans and colleagues remembered him for his sharp timing, professionalism, and quiet brilliance. Co-stars from other shows and films described him as gracious, meticulous, and deeply committed to his craft. But one name was conspicuously missing from the tributes: Carl Reiner. There was no public statement, no acknowledgement in Variety, no letter to the editor, and no mention in Reiner's later autobiographies. Considering that The Dick Van Dyke Show had made both men television icons, the silence was puzzling. Some believed Reiner was simply grieving privately. Others weren't so sure. In a 1995 interview with the Television Academy Foundation, Reiner was asked whether he had stayed in touch with his former castmates. He spoke warmly of Dick Van Dyke, beamed while recalling Mary Tyler Moore, and shared fond memories of Maury Amsterdam. But when Richard Deacon's name came up, Reiner hesitated. He was complicated, he finally said. A fine actor, precise. He wanted things a certain way. Then he moved on to another topic. There were no stories, no warmth, no humor, just a curt acknowledgement that felt more like a professional courtesy than a remembrance. And that single word, complicated, lingered. What did it mean? Was it a polite euphemism for creative tension, or did it point to something deeper and more personal? Some who knew them suggested that Deacon, a lifelong bachelor who fiercely guarded his privacy, may have felt judged or dismissed by Reiner. The two men couldn't have been more different. Reiner was outgoing, spontaneous, and collaborative, thriving in a fast-paced, improvisational environment. Deacon was quiet, structured, and disciplined, preferring clear boundaries and careful preparation. When those two creative temperaments collided, it didn't just cause friction. It left wounds that never healed. Even in the years following the show, during anniversary specials and nostalgic retrospectives, Deacon's absence was glaring. Reiner and the surviving cast rarely mentioned him, as though he had quietly been erased from the show's collective memory. His face was missing from reunion photos, his name from highlight reels. There were no anecdotes, no shared laughter, no archival tributes. It was as if Mel Cooley, the character, had outlived Richard Deacon, the man. Yet among devoted fans and classic television enthusiasts, Deacon's legacy endured. His subtle expressions, dry delivery, and impeccable comedic rhythm remained a masterclass in understated acting. The more people learned about the quiet tension behind the scenes, the more poignant his performances felt. Beneath the smirks, the awkward glances, and the nervous half-smiles, there seemed to be something real, a trace of the unease he carried off camera. And then, years after his death, a rumor began to circulate, never printed, never confirmed, but passed quietly among old industry veterans and fan circles. The whisper was that the rift between Deacon and Reiner hadn't been purely creative. It was personal. Some claimed Deacon resented how Reiner had sidelined him, giving other actors more dynamic material while Mel Cooley was left as comic relief. Despite being a core cast member, his screen time was minimal compared to the rest. Whether the rumors were true or not, the story reflected something that had always been visible to those who looked closely. Behind Richard Deacon's quiet professionalism was a man who had never fully found peace with the show that made him famous. Carl Reiner, after all, wrote The Dick Van Dyke Show. He controlled the scripts. And over time, fans began to notice that Mel Cooley's scenes grew shorter and less central. What started as a strong supporting role slowly faded into the background. According to a studio staffer interviewed for a 1987 retrospective, someone who declined to go on record, Deacon had not been happy with how things were handled behind the scenes. That vague statement fueled decades of speculation. Some believed Reiner and Deacon had argued about the direction of the show. Others thought Deacon had pushed for more screen time and was quietly punished for it. And a few suspected the truth was something neither man ever wanted made public. It didn't help that Reiner, known for his warmth and wit, also had a sharp tongue when crossed. He could be fiercely loyal, but he could hold a grudge, and Deacon wasn't the type to back down. Colleagues described him as someone who knew his worth and refused to play the Hollywood game if it meant compromising his principles. One former CBS producer recalled a closed-door meeting where Deacon allegedly walked out after clashing with a producer over a comedic scene he felt was demeaning. He didn't yell or threaten, he simply stood up, adjusted his tie, and left. That was who he was, proud, professional, and unwilling to be anyone's punchline. So when whispers of a deeper rift between Deacon and Reiner began circulating, fans didn't dismiss them. They nodded, because it fit the man they had come to understand. Still, the strangest part of the story is that even decades later, neither Reiner nor anyone close to the show ever addressed the tension directly. No denials, no clarifications, just silence. And when silence lasts that long, it starts to sound like confirmation. Today, as more fans revisit the Dick Van Dyke Show, they rewatch Mel Cooley's scenes with new eyes, wondering what was real, what was performance, and what quiet frustration might have been hiding behind that carefully controlled expression. And perhaps the clearest glimpse into that truth came from a forgotten interview that resurfaced decades after his death. Just a year before Richard Deacon passed away in 1984, he gave a rare extended interview to a small Palm Springs radio station. It was never widely broadcast, and the tape sat in obscurity for years until a transcription appeared online in 2016, shared by a longtime fan who had collected rare material from television's golden age. In the interview, Deacon spoke affectionately about his love for stage work, his pride in Leave It to Beaver, and his fondness for the early days of live television. He reflected on fame, on aging out of roles, and on what he called the bittersweet beauty of being remembered for one thing, even when you've done so much more. Then, near the end of the conversation, the host asked a simple question. "Was there ever a co-star you just couldn't click with?" Deacon paused. There was nearly 5 seconds of silence. You could hear the host shifting uncomfortably, unsure if he'd answer at all. Finally, Deacon said, "Let's just say, when someone writes your lines, edits your scenes, and shapes your character, you learn very quickly whether they're your ally or just your boss. And Carl, he was always the boss." He didn't sound angry or bitter, just calm and measured. But it was revealing. A quiet acknowledgement that the power dynamic behind the camera had never felt right to him. It was the closest he ever came to confirming what fans had long suspected, that behind the laughter, the wit, and the perfect sitcom polish, something had remained unresolved. Deacon never mentioned Carl Reiner publicly again. He never wrote about him, never joined reunion specials, never commented on the Dick Van Dyke Show in later interviews. And when Reiner passed away in 2020, tributes flooded in from friends, co-stars, and admirers across the entertainment world, but not one mentioned Richard Deacon. Maybe it was just a creative clash. Maybe it was pride. Or maybe it was a wound that time never healed. Whatever it was, it left a quiet mark on both men's legacies. A reminder that even in television's golden age, not every story ended with laughter.